So I'm really curious. I mean, obviously it's a personal interest as well as an indie author myself. Um, but I'm really interested in your journey as an indie author and the path that the path of it.
Okay. Um, yeah, it's an interesting one because I think I had initially quite a traditional focused experience from like the
Mm.
beginning. So I did a creative writing degree. I did a master's of publishing, both of which didn't touch independent publishing at all. It
Mm.
was completely focused on the traditional space, and not only the traditional space, but very much the classics and literary fiction.
Yeah.
Barely any discussion of genre or commercial fiction or anything like that. So I think that's an interesting place to come from and then go into indie publishing. And I've told this story a few times now, but I originally had a publishing contract with a traditional publisher for a literary fiction manuscript, and this was years ago now. And I sort of, I guess, long story short, had the realization that I needed to really be writing what I loved reading. And
Mm.
this sort of like male dominated literary fiction wasn't that. So I think in order to escape the drudgery that I was finding this particular experience, I did NaNoWriMo and wrote Heart of Mist. And somewhere along the way, had it in my head, I'm going to indie publish this. And once I'd committed to doing that, I wasn't looking back at all. And I enjoy the business side. I enjoy the production side. There's something really magical about being able to put together your own book from start to
Mm.
finish and have the creative control and have the, control over the production schedule. And I think, my experiences in my masters and dealing with other publishers, and also through I used to run Writers Edit, which is an online learning
Yeah.
platform for writers. Through all these different experiences, I guess I sort of identified the elements of traditional publishing that I didn't enjoy. And it turns out in indie publishing, those are the elements that you control, that, you
Yeah.
can make your own. Yeah. And so I think, once I'd made that decision, I invested in quite an expensive course, but I think that was an important step for me in order to realize, like, I'm taking this really seriously. This is a career move. This isn't a whim. This is something
Yeah.
that's going to be a foundation for the next, 2-3 decades of my life, hopefully. So yeah, that's sort of how it all kicked off.
Mm. That's really cool. And I think that's the other thing, people forget that this is a business. And I think indie publishers, indie authors, the ones that do it with multiple books and who want to make it a career, they know that as much as it's a creative it's a creative process and there's a huge creative element to it, it is also a business.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and I was thinking about this because I think, especially in terms of marketing, the difference between what indie authors do and what traditionally published authors do, it's becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. Like, really, the only difference is that indie authors output the cost themselves of the marketing. If you're buying an ad, if you're buying a campaign on BookBub, you pay for it. Whereas
Yeah.
if a traditional publisher puts a galley up on NetGalley, they pay for the subscription. Like, that's really the only difference. And I think I'm really fascinated by that. And I'm really fascinated because as a traditionally published author, sure, I mean, like, you don't have to pay and you get the advance, but also you don't necessarily have the training. And it's still actually your time. Like, it's still your time that you're investing in, cultivating a social media following, going to festivals, setting up interviews. But you don't have as much of the control either. Like, you don't have necessarily as much control over your time, over what message and what brand you are,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
how the book itself is marketed, packaged, edited. So it's a really interesting one. And I say that as someone who, like, yes, under the right circumstances, I would take a traditional publishing contract.
Mm.
But also, having done indie, I think you're about 6 months ahead of me. You were like May 2017?
I was August 2017.
August 2017. So you're only 3 months ahead of me.
Right.
So as someone who's been doing it basically as long as you, without having quite as much success, you've done an amazing job. Um, like there's so many benefits to it. So what are your big takeaways from like the indie process? What advice would you give to someone who was looking to move into that sphere?
I guess the first thing I would say is take the time, and if you have it, the money, to educate yourself on the industry, on the production process, on, you know, really examining what sort of books you want to put out and who your comp authors and comp titles are and that sort of thing. Look at what other people are doing, because there's so much to be learned from the people who came before you. And yeah, like, I mean, I think one of the biggest mistakes that people make when they're thinking about indie authors is that it's this like super fast, super quick, you know, sort of hard and fast thing that you can just do and get your book out. But if you do it right, and this is some cheesy line that I forget where it came from, but if you do self-publishing right, it's nothing about self at all. Like, it's not a solo effort. I have a production team just like, you know, HarperCollins has one. It's smaller, but all the same people are there, like the beta readers, the copy editors, the proofreaders, the cover designers. I've got a map maker, all these different people who are part of this team. And I think you've got to educate yourself on who you need in your team. Can you afford them? How to make that happen? And then I did a course. The course that I mentioned before was called Self-Publishing 101 by Mark Dawson. And like, I'm not going to lie, it's an expensive course. I think it was probably upwards of $1,000, which is a huge cost. And that's before you put any money into the production of your own books. But for me, that course was an investment in myself, was an investment in my career. And I've made that back easy. I made that back within the first week of publishing that book.
Really
so
awesome.
Yeah, so I think, you know, the main takeaway is to educate yourself. Don't go in blind. Don't go in and assume it's going to be this easy path, because I think that's another thing that indie authors, you know, sort of battle against, is the stigmas that come with it, that indie books aren't as good, that indie authors are those authors who couldn't get published traditionally, so they've taken this like last resort thing. And that's just not the case at all. And if you're doing it well, you'll know all about that, and you'll know who you need on your team and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, I could ramble on about it all day, but if I'm going to give you one takeaway, it would definitely be the importance of educating yourself. And I mean, there's so much information available for free online. The benefit to that course was that it was all neatly bundled. It was like set out like an online university course. But there are super cheap ebooks on self-publishing that you can get. You can Google how to self-publish, and you might have to sift through a lot of information, but that education I think you can get for free, as long as you're willing to put in the time and the effort and the energy to understanding the industry and understanding where you as an author might fit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. And I think if I were to tag anything onto that, marketing, what you put in is what you get out. Like it is a directly proportional thing. Like whatever your marketing budget is, I mean, you need to also make sure that where your marketing is actually going to be helpful and going to be useful. And I think the marketing sites and the marketing campaigns to run have changed over the last 4 years, but like it is a literal equation.
It's an interesting, I think that's an interesting point between potentially indie and traditional. When you were talking about traditional marketing and stuff before, two things. I think unless you're a lead title with a publisher, your marketing budget and the marketing efforts going into your book, I don't think they're going to be anything special. And you sort of get this 6-week window to have your book do well. Yeah. And if it doesn't do well, it just sort of like falls off the edge of a cliff sort of thing. And the second thing, when I worked with Writer's Edit, I used to get sent arcs and stuff without requesting them, without having reviewed another book like them. And it might have changed since then, but the traditional marketing approach to me seemed very much like, we're just going to throw as much spaghetti at the wall and just see what sticks.
Yeah,
100%. Whereas if you're indie, and what I think has helped me do well is that you have the control to target people specifically who just review books like yours. So, you can find a comp title. So for the Oromia Chronicles, for example, one of the comp titles for me has always been Throne of Glass. So what I might do is Google, Throne of Glass reviews and have a look at who's reviewing that book, who loved it. Don't even bother with the people who don't like it. And then you find the people who are giving it 4 and 5 stars, check their review policy. And then, they might be people that you approach rather than just putting it out there or throwing it out into the void and potentially not reaching the right people and getting bad reviews for a book that's actually good, but you just targeted the wrong people, or not getting any reviews at all, which is also, it doesn't help any book.